Hi, I'm Jean Ann Duckworth, and today's word is hope. Yesterday was 9/11, and I remember 18 years ago, many people following the attacks didn't feel a sense of hope. People were frightened, they were confused, they were discouraged, they were angry. Hope wasn't one of the feelings that seemed to be coming into play. When a tragedy occurs, sometimes it's difficult to have hope. And on 9/11, I heard of a tragedy of a different sort, and that's what led me to choose hope for today's message. I live in Southern California, and Greg Laurie is a well-known pastor in our area. He does Harvest Crusade. Every year he has a huge church out in Riverside County. And he had a young pastor, young man, who worked at his church. And as part of his ministry, he and his wife did mental health advocacy. I assume he chose that topic because it was personal to him. He struggled with mental health issues, with depression and anxiety. I say both because they tend to go together. And on Tuesday, I guess it was Monday or Tuesday, the struggle ended for him. We can't ever know what goes through somebody's mind at any time in life, but especially when the time comes that they decide to take their own life. I just can't help but feel this sense of hopelessness, this lack of hope, this thought that things may never get better. I deal with depression and anxiety on a much lower scale, but still, on any scale, it can be a struggle some days. And especially with depression, I always tell people that anxiety, you know when you're anxious because, I get all twitchy. Mr. D will tell me, go out and walk around, burn some of that energy off. But depression is a lot harder to pick up on sometimes. It's a nice, comfy blanket that you wrap around yourself and you curl up on the couch and you leave the lights off or just one dim light and you don't move for a while. And it's very comfortable and sadly enough, it can even be reassuring until you come to the realization that you haven't accomplished anything. And then it gets discouraging. When I have days like that, multiple days sometimes, I try to force myself to get up and move. One of the ironic parts of depression is a side effect of it is it causes joint stiffness. So you try and get up and move and it hurts. And part of your brain tells you, well, it's just easier to lay back down and not do anything. And especially if you're at a point where you don't feel a whole lot of hope. Part of you was something inside is saying, why bother? But the thing about hope, I always believe it's somewhere within us, but more than that, hope is something that stands ahead of us on that journey. It beckons to us to move ahead and to get to where it is. We don't always see it. We don't always hear it. Sometimes we close our eyes and ears to it, but it's there. The story that comes to mind for this, I usually use to talk about faith, but it struck me today how it's about hope. After Jesus was crucified, the disciples locked themselves in a room. Granted, I think in part they did it because they were terrified the authorities were going to come for them next, but I think primarily they felt hopeless. They'd been following a leader for a few years, and now he was gone, and they didn't know what was next. And it frightened them, and they didn't have any hope for tomorrow. And it paralyzed them. They just couldn't move. They just sat in this room. Meanwhile, somewhere across town or wherever it might have been were three women who got up very early in the morning, feeling just as hopeless as the disciples, but they had business to take care of. You see, Jesus died after sundown on the Sabbath, when the Sabbath started. And as such, the Hebrew law said they couldn't do any work, which included preparing his body for permanent entombment. So he was just wrapped in a cloth and laid in the tomb, and the women were going to come back on Sunday after the Sabbath had ended, since the Jewish Sabbath is on Saturday. They weren't feeling very perky. This was a man that meant more to them than any of them could say, especially to one of the women, because it was his mother. But this was an obligation they had. It was one final act of love they could do for him. And so they got up and gathered the materials that they needed, and they started off. And when they arrived, rather than Jesus, what they found was hope. Hope that things would continue. Don't cry, Jean Ann, you're better than this. Hope that there would be tomorrow and the day after, and that they just had to keep pushing on. A hope that we can't even imagine, but we can experience. Hope can be elusive. And sometimes we think hope can be disappointing, but it's there, just ahead of us and deep inside of us. And it's beckoning to us to just keep going, even when it's hard. I'm Jean Ann Duckworth, and today's word is hope.